Hi, Murray Hibbard here. I've never done this type of thing before, but I've had a number of people ask me how I make my pastry, and so I thought I would give it a try making a pastry tutorial. We're going to do it in two parts. Part one is going to be making the pastry itself. Part two will be making pies and tarts out of that pastry. Okay, so hopefully what you're going to find from this is that pastry really isn't as difficult or as scary as it's made out to be. So anyway, without any further ado, let's get started. The recipe I use is really simple. It only calls for 4 ingredients, and one of them is water, lard, butter, kind of the same thing almost, and then flour and water. Oh, my photographer says it's not the same thing. It's grease. Anyway, so it makes a lot of pastry. It makes enough pastry for 4 dozen butter tarts or probably 6 pies, depending on whether it's single or double crust. So you might want to cut this recipe down. It cuts down quite well. So for our full recipe, we are going to start with a full pound of lard. And we're going to put it in our mixing bowl, if it'll come out. Here it comes. There it is. And along with the lard, we put a half a cup of butter. I should use a clean plate. Now, I don't like measuring butter, so I do it by weight instead of by volume. If you don't use a kitchen scale, I highly recommend one. We're looking for 114 grams of butter, which is going to be kind of like that. That's good enough. Okay, so the butter and the lard go in. What I'm going to do next, I believe, is the secret to good pastry. I got this recipe and all the hints from my sister-in-law, Margaret Hibbard, and if you really want to see how it should be done, you should watch her. Anyway, the trick that seems to make all the difference is beating the lard and the butter together until it is incredibly well creamed. You might want to really go after your butter first, because it's typically a lot harder than your lard, but just make sure it gets all well creamed. Okay, you can shut that off. You want? As you can see, the lard likes to ride up on the beaters, at least on mine. And there we go. Okay. The next thing the recipe calls for is 6 cups of flour. In my experience, this is never enough. But how much it does take varies depending on so many variables: time of year, elevation, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to start with about 6.5, 6 3/4, something like that. I hate people who cook and bake and stuff and don't follow recipes exactly. And now I've become one. 3, 4, 5, 6, And yeah, somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4. Okay, now we're going to take the beaters back to these again, but it's critical this time not to beat it too much. We only want to beat it. This is instead of cutting it in with the old pastry cutter. We still want to end up with the same kind of texture, which is, as they usually say, about the texture of green peas. So we'll beat this on slow until we get it where we want it. Okay, there we go, something like that. You don't have to do this. Once we have our texture where we want it, we take a fork and take a look at it to see how much flour is less mixed in with the other, and it looks like we've done fairly well. The next thing the recipe calls for, the last thing it calls for, is 1 cup of cold water. Now, a lot of where's my cup measure? A lot of people will tell you that when you're using the cold water for your pastry, it should be ice water or put it in the fridge or whatever. I just run the tap until I get it as cold as humanly possible, and then do it that way. But if you want to, theoretically all these tricks are supposed to help a little bit at a time. Just put it all in like that. We do not want to use our beaters from here on out. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take a spatula here. This is my second time making pastry today, so I have a spatula out already. And I'm just going to keep working it like this. You do not want to knead pastry like you would knead bread. You hear people say all the time that the less pastry is worked with, the better. But don't worry a whole lot about that. As long as you don't intentionally go and knead it, you're not going to hurt it. I've always heard growing up that pastry was so difficult to work with. I find it very forgiving myself. Okay, this is the bit about I can't give you an exact recipe because the quantities of flour change. So I just keep working at it with the pastry like this, and you see there are bits of flour there that are still very floury, as opposed to being incorporated into the lard. So I keep working with this to see if I can get it all together. If in short order I can't, and I don't think I'm going to I'm going to come close, but I'm not quite going to, I'm going to have to put a tiny bit more water in. Okay. What we want to end up with is we want to end up with something that holds together when we do what I'm doing here. It just about is. Let me keep going and see if I can do this. But on the other side of things, we don't want it to be so wet that we can't roll it out. So it's a balancing act that we have to do. The thing I hate bakers and cooks saying is until the texture is just right. But it really is what you have to do. If you put too much water in, if it's too wet, go ahead and put some more flour in and try to work that in. If it's not holding together, put some more water in. I think we actually have it where we want it. So I'm going to get all the pastry off of my spatula. And the proof of the pudding well, it's not really pudding, is it? About how it is when we pick it up, will it stay together? Okay, so I usually just pick it up like that. I have a little bit left in the bowl there. So once I pick it up and try to make a ball out of it, then usually what I'll do, and you don't have to do this, this is just kind of fun, is I'll just give it a roll a few times and it'll pick up whatever little bits of pastry are left there. Okay, now I have my ball of pastry. What I'm going to do next is put it on a plate and flatten it out. And then I'm going to put it in the fridge for maybe half an hour. Maybe not even quite that. I often start almost immediately. But we put it in the fridge because it does get a little bit easier to work with once it's been in the fridge for a while. Okay, so stay tuned. Okay, let's get our pastry out of the fridge. And there it is. Now I'm going to cut this in 6 because I'm hoping to get 6 pies out of this. If I were making only butter tarts, I would cut it in 4 because 1/4 will make a dozen tarts. And I said I was going to cut it in 6 and I went ahead and cut it in quarters. That's okay. We're only taking this as far as rolling it out tonight anyway. I'll put the rest of this back in the fridge and we'll get rolling. See what I did there? Get rolling. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to have a, I say lightly floured surface, but I'm fairly generous with it actually. And then we want flour on both sides of our pastry and on our rolling pin. Then we just start rolling. We frequently, and I can't stress this enough, frequently turn this over, making sure that there's pastry all the way around it. When we're making, flour all the way around it, on both sides. When we're rolling out for a pie, we want to start from the middle and roll out, okay, in all directions. If I see a little dip like this, I might actually try to use the end of my rolling pin to try to encourage it out a little bit that way. But keep flipping it, because if you don't, it will start sticking to the bottom of the to the counter. Okay, the bottom of the pastry will start sticking to the counter, and that gets really difficult to do. Okay, so just keep going like this. Do not do this. This is not how you roll pastry. Okay, even motions from the middle out to the outside. Frequent turning. You will know when it's time to quit when it feels like the pastry is about to break when you pick it up. Other people will tell you things like, you know, whatever fraction of an inch. I don't do well with 1/4, 1/8 inch, 1/16 inch, whatever. I even have a magic rolling pin that has that, and I still don't like doing it. So my thing is, when it feels like it's about to break, then you're done. That actually takes us to the end of part 1 of making pastry. We were only taking this as far as rolling it out. Now, if you're rolling it out for tarts, you don't have to worry about shaping it into a nice circle. If anything, it works as well or better. Actually, you know what? Let's take this a tiny bit further. I want to do some rolling out of tarts as well. Okay, so the next thing is, how do you get the pastry into the pan? And again, there's a few tricks, but I find what's best is just starting at one corner and gently, gently, gently rolling it like that. Once we've rolled it, we get our pie pan and just put it on the edge like that and unroll it back out on top of the pie pan. Works quite well. Then we want to get it sitting in the pan. Then all this extra stuff here, we just want to get rid of it. So we have our kitchen scissors, and we'll just go around. Don't cut it too close to the top, leave a little bit, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay. We can reuse this. We don't throw the cuttings away. So what I do next is I just curl the pastry under, okay, all the way around until I've made a complete 360 degree. Speaking. Okay, until we've gone all the way around and our pastry is curled under. And then what we do, partly for aesthetics and partly for practical reasons, is we flute it like this. Just thumb and finger pushing one way, index finger of the other hand pushing another way. Okay, looks nice and pretty, but it also keeps the pastry from shrinking, which isn't too much of a big deal unless you're doing a single crust pre-baked shell before you put, like for a lemon meringue pie. We'll get more into that in part 2 of our tutorial. But there we have it. And we're ready to pour in our pumpkin pie filling, which is what this is for, since this is Canadian Thanksgiving. And so that's our pie shell. Now I'm going to get another bit of dough out of the fridge and show you making pastry for tarts. Okay, so we'll get a quarter, because that is for tarts. And again, we want our well-floured surface. I'll put a little bit more on. There we are. And then we'll start rolling again. To a large degree, this is exactly like we did a moment ago with our pie shell, except, like I said, we don't need to make it round. In fact, as I said, there is some advantage when you're making tarts to actually making it oblong. And you'll see why in a moment when you go to cut it out. Okay, again, we keep flipping it over and over, being very generous with the flour so that our pastry doesn't stick. Remember when I said we don't want it too dry because the flour won't stick to the lard, but we don't want it too wet because it'll be too sticky? This is why we don't want it too wet, because if we try to roll it out, doesn't matter how much flour you use, it's always going to stick to the counter, and you'll never be able to flip it. Okay, I could tell last time I flipped that it was about to break, so I'm not going to flip it again. Now we're going to cut out our tart shells. Look around your kitchen for something that is the right size. I use my Kraft peanut butter bear head from decades ago. We use it to keep our coconut in, but when I make tarts, I take the lid off, and that's what I use. You can look around your kitchen for exactly the right thing for you. So I have my handy dandy peanut butter lid, and I'm ready to cut out my rounds. Now this is a bit like playing, is it Jenga? Whatever it is, where you have to see how much you can fit. It's good to get as much as you can out of one rolling of pastry. Because otherwise you're working with what I call rework, the cuttings, which you'll see in a moment. And the less you have to work with rework, the better it is, because of the whole thing about don't work your pastry any more than you have to. So now I'm just going to take out the unwanted cuttings, which we will reuse. This is part of what I call rework. But the fewer times that you have to rework, the better. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up each one of these, just get a knife under it a little bit to get it started, and pile them up on the corner. Now, even if I get something that's a little less wonderful as far as roundness is concerned, again, people aren't going to notice by the time you get it into the tart pan and get it filled. Okay, so I haven't been counting, but I think that's roughly 7 that I have there. What I'm going to do next is, usually the middle part is a little bit thicker than the rest, so I'm just going to roll it out a little bit more and get a couple more cuttings out of that original rolling. Oops. There. How thick you roll, thick or thin you roll your pastry is really a matter of personal choice. Some people just love pastry and they like a nice thick crust. I think thick crust can be overdone. However, if you get it too thin, you can actually have your butter tart filling seeping right through, and that's a little bit unpleasant as well. So, as you probably noticed, I just bunched all of the rework together into a ball and started all over again. Looks like maybe I need a little bit more flour here. Okay. And there's our rework ready for more cutting out. We're only going to get 2 out of that one. And we just keep going like that, bunching it together and rolling it out and cutting it until there's only room for 1. Okay, all of our rounds have been cut now and we're ready to put them in the pan. I've already made a dozen butter tarts earlier, so my pan here, I've just taken the tarts out and I haven't even cleaned out the pan. The little bit of grease that's in the bottom isn't going to hurt at all. If anything, it might actually help. So what I do is just pick up the shell, kind of pinch it in on all 4 sides, and let it just rest in the pan like that. Okay? Okay, so we're coming down the home stretch now. So again, we take it, oh, here's the one that didn't get cut quite evenly, but again, it doesn't matter. When you press it on all 4 sides and put it in, it looks like all the others. So you can get away with an awful lot. And then once I do that, then I'm taking and pushing out anything that's indented. Okay, there's going to be roughly 4 indents on each one, and I'm just pushing them out. Okay. Just like that, until these look like these, and they will hold butter tart filling. Let me talk to you for a minute while I'm doing this about pan care. And I've never heard anyone else say this. This is just my own thing. I don't use soap. I don't use any kind of dish detergent when I'm cleaning my pans out. I only use hot water. I'll soak them in there if I have some pastry that's burned on, but I don't use soap. And I have found that since I quit using soap in my tart pans, that they're easier and easier to get tarts out of. So for whatever it's worth, that's what I do with my tart pans. Okay. And that takes us to the end of part one of making the pastry. We've seen making it, we've seen rolling it out, we've seen putting it into tart pans and putting it into pie pans. So I hope you will come back for part two, where we look at putting the filling in and talk about how to bake a two-shell pie, how to bake a one-shell pie, how to pre-bake a pie shell before you put in your, for example, lemon meringue pie, how to get butter tart filling into the butter tarts. Lots of little tricks that I think you might be interested in. Thanks.